Sometimes the most familiar places hide secrets that should stay hidden. What is behind doors that no one has opened for years? Keep watching. The story ahead will stay with you. Subscribe, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Daniel Hayes had lived in the city for too long. He lived there long enough for the noise of traffic and the endless glow of bright signs to feel normal to him. Every morning he followed the same path to work, past the same busy street corners. He returned in the evenings to an apartment whose thin walls let him hear every sound from his neighbors' lives. He told himself this was normal, that this was just how modern life worked. But deep down he felt trapped. The smell of burnt coffee in the office, the endless meetings and gray workspaces, the crowded streets. All of this made lines appear on his face that made him look older than he was. Only after his father died did he realize he could not keep living this way. His father had worked his whole life, saving money and giving up things he wanted. Then he left the world without ever making his dreams come true. That thought hit Daniel hard. He understood that if he did not change something soon, he might end up the same way. So he took a step that shocked even himself. He quit his job, sold his few belongings, and began searching for a place where silence could replace the constant noise of the city. When he saw the advertisement for an old wooden house with a stone foundation and 16 hectares of land around it, his heart jumped. The price was unusually low, but he convinced himself that good luck had finally come to him. Within weeks, he was standing on the porch of his new home, staring across the meadow to the tree line and breathing in air that felt sharper and cleaner than anything he had known in the city. The house was old, definitely old. The floors creaked under his weight. The beams groaned with every gust of wind, and the windows rattled in their frames. But Daniel felt no disappointment. To him, these problems gave the house character. He unpacked boxes of books, set his father's old clock on the fireplace, and filled the walls with family photographs. Slowly, the space began to feel less like a stranger's property and more like his own safe place. Each day, he discovered something new. The deer that moved silently among the trees, the wild flowers that turned the meadow into a sea of colors, the slow spreading of fog from the lake at dawn. For the first time in years, he felt the heavy weight on his chest get lighter. Yet, even as he accepted this new life, he could not ignore the strange reactions of the villagers. At the local store, he introduced himself and was met with politeness, but not warmth. Their eyes shifted when he mentioned the lake. One old man, whose hands were rough from many years of work, made a remark that Daniel found hard to forget. "That lake of yours," the man said quietly. "It has its stories. Best not to go poking around there." The words were spoken casually, but his stare stayed on Daniel with a strength that made him uncomfortable. He laughed it off at the time, telling himself it was nothing more than country superstition, a piece of old stories meant to keep old memories alive. But that night, standing on his porch with the cool air brushing against his face, he found himself staring toward the hidden water with a strange unease. The days passed with a rhythm both comforting and unfamiliar. He chopped firewood, repaired loose shutters, walked barefoot across the meadow. The silence of the countryside was different from the silence of the city. It was not empty, but full, filled with the soft sounds of rustling branches, distant bird calls, and the quiet hum of insects. Still, whenever the wind came from the direction of the lake, Daniel felt the air shift in a way he could not explain. The memory of the old man's words returned to him, staying like an echo. At night, the house creaked and sighed with the movements of old wood, but Daniel grew used to it. He told himself that a building this old had its own language, one he was learning to understand. Sometimes, though, when he closed his eyes, he thought he heard something more, a faint dripping sound or the hollow moan of water moving through hidden spaces. He dismissed it quickly, telling himself it was his imagination or pipes buried deep beneath the foundation. But in the darkness, when only the steady ticking of his father's clock filled the room, doubt stayed with him. One evening he stood again at the porch, watching as the sun dropped below the trees and the shadows grew thicker over the meadow. The line of forest that hid the lake seemed almost alive in that fading light. Its darkness was heavy, its silence deeper than the rest of the woods. Daniel tried to laugh at himself, to dismiss the feeling, but his chest tightened anyway. He wanted peace, he reminded himself. He had left the city to find quiet, not to chase ghosts. Yet something about the land he had chosen, Something about the way the villagers had spoken of it told him that his search for peace had only just begun. The morning light spilled through the windows of the old house, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and pine. Daniel tried to start his day with simple tasks: brewing coffee, stacking firewood near the fireplace, fixing a loose hinge on a cupboard door. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the lake. The old man's words echoed in his mind with a strength that made him uncomfortable. Best not to go poking around there. He told himself he would ignore the warning, but curiosity pushed against him like a hand at his back. By midday, he gave up resisting and set out toward the water. The forest was thicker than he remembered. Branches curved overhead, blocking out patches of sky. The silence here was different from the meadow's silence. It seemed heavier, as though it had weight. When Daniel finally pushed through the last bushes, he stood before the lake. Its surface was perfectly still, reflecting the pale sky like a sheet of glass. The stillness should have been calming, but instead it made him uncomfortable. The air felt thick, almost as though the place itself were holding its breath. He walked slowly along the bank, looking at the ground, and that was when he saw it. Half hidden under moss and weeds, a circle of stones stuck up from the soil. They were too regular to be natural. Their surfaces were darkened by age, but arranged in a deliberate pattern. Daniel crouched, brushing away dirt with his hands. His fingers slipped over the rough edges, and he noticed a shallow dip at the circle's center. Then, as he leaned closer, he felt it, a faint breath of cold air escaping from between the stones, cool against his skin. His pulse quickened. This was no ordinary rock formation. Perhaps an old well, he told himself, or some forgotten drainage structure. But why had it been sealed so carefully, covered by years of moss and soil? The thought excited him as much as it made him nervous. He pressed his hand against the largest stone, and once again the air whispered out, damp and smelling like minerals, as though breathed out from the earth itself. Daniel stood, staring down at the circle. The lake sat nearby, silent and unmoving, its reflection blank and harsh. He forced a laugh, brushed his hands on his jeans, and returned home. But the image stayed with him long after the sun set. That night, sleep refused to come. He lay awake, listening to the groans of the house and the steady tick of his father's clock. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the circle of stones and imagined the cold breeze against his skin. Eventually, exhaustion took over, but his dreams were restless and filled with shadows of water and stone. When he woke before dawn, he knew he would not be able to ignore the place any longer. By mid-morning, he had convinced himself to return. He packed a flashlight, gloves, and a crowbar, though he told himself it was only to be careful. The walk to the lake felt different this time. The trees were closer, the silence heavier. When he stepped into the clearing, the lake lay still and waiting, as if expecting him. He moved quickly to the circle of stones and knelt once more. His hands pressed against the largest rock, and this time he leaned his weight into it. The stone resisted at first, but then shifted with a grinding scrape, tilting to reveal a dark gap beneath. A rush of colder air escaped, sharp with the smell of earth that had not seen daylight in years. Daniel's breath caught. He crouched closer, shining the flashlight into the opening. At first, he saw only darkness, but then the beam showed stone steps going down into the earth, slick with water droplets. His heart pounded. This was no well, no drainage pipe. It was an entrance. He hesitated, gripping the flashlight tighter. Every sensible thought in his mind screamed caution. He had no idea how stable the structure might be, no clue what dangers lay below. But curiosity pulled at him stronger than fear. He swung his legs into the gap and set his feet on the first step. The stone was damp and cold. He lowered himself carefully, one step at a time, the narrow walls pressing close on either side. Water dripped somewhere above, each drop echoing like a distant clock. The descent seemed endless, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness, catching patches of moss on the walls. Once his foot slipped, sending panic through him, but he steadied himself against the wall until his breathing slowed. At last, the steps ended, opening onto a narrow corridor. The ceiling was low enough that he had to bend down, and his footsteps echoed strangely, bouncing far ahead into silence. He moved slowly, shining the light along the walls. Rusted pieces littered the ground, nails, splinters of wood, a corroded length of chain. Daniel crouched, lifting one piece. It was so fragile it nearly crumbled in his hand. People had been here once. This was no natural cave. Someone had carved this passage, used it, and then left it behind. The corridor stretched on until it widened suddenly into a chamber. Daniel stopped at the doorway, his flashlight beam shaking across the space. The chamber opened onto a pool of water larger than any well, its surface dark and still. Droplets fell steadily from the ceiling, sending ripples across the water that spread and vanished into shadow. The air here was colder, heavy with minerals thick enough to taste. He stepped closer, his boots slipping slightly on slick stone. The flashlight beam skimmed over the surface of the water, catching on debris along the edge. Rusted tools, pieces of wood, and something metallic glinting faintly beneath a film of green slime. Daniel crouched at the water's edge, his breath shallow. A half-buried crate appeared in the light, its wooden boards warped and swollen, but still holding together. Inside, beneath layers of mud, he thought he saw the faint shimmer of metal. He reached out, then pulled back, instinct warning him. The water was too dark, too deep, and one mistake could drag him under. He leaned back on his heels, his pulse racing. The silence pressed in on him, heavier than before, as though the earth itself was listening. His flashlight flickered once, sputtering before becoming steady again. He cursed under his breath, the sound swallowed quickly by the chamber. Daniel stood, sweeping the beam across the walls. Wooden supports stuck out from the stone, remnants of a structure that had once reached into the water, a dock perhaps, or a platform. Most of it had collapsed, leaving only jagged beams reaching out like skeleton fingers. This place had not been left carelessly. It had been sealed. The circle of stones above had not marked a well, but a barrier, a warning meant to keep strangers out. His chest tightened as he realized what he had done. He had opened the seal, stepped into the forgotten, and uncovered something that was never meant to be found. He stood at the edge of the corridor, staring into the chamber as the sound of dripping echoed around him like the ticking of some ancient clock. For a moment, he considered turning back, sealing the stones again, and pretending he had seen nothing. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was a lie. When he finally climbed back up the steps, daylight struck him like a shock. He came out into the clearing, gasping for air, blinking against the brightness. The circle of stones lay scattered behind him, no longer a hidden treasure, but a broken seal. He stood for a long moment, staring at them, unease coiling in his chest. He had gone down once, and though every part of him knew he should leave it alone, another part whispered that he would return. The house seemed different after Daniel's discovery. He tried to convince himself that it was only his imagination, that the creaks of the old beams and the groans of the walls were the same as they had always been. But every sound now felt important. At night, he could not sleep. The steady ticking of his father's clock filled the rooms, but beneath it, he thought he heard the faint drip of water. It was as if the underground lake had followed him, its silence seeping through the floorboards. He would close his eyes and see the warped crate half underwater in the shadows, the glint of metal beneath the surface, the broken beams sticking out like skeleton hands. He told himself he had no reason to return, yet he knew the truth. The place had hooked itself into him, and his mind would not let go. By the second morning, the restlessness became unbearable. He moved about the kitchen, brewing coffee, cleaning dishes, chopping wood, but each task fell apart under the weight of his thoughts. The image of the circle of stones, the cold breath of air against his skin, the endless corridor underground, all of it pulled at him. He had come here for peace, for solitude, but now silence only reminded him of what lay beneath the earth. By midday, he accepted what he had known since the moment he left the chamber. He would have to go back. This time, he prepared carefully. He packed a coil of rope, a set of fresh batteries for the flashlight, sturdy gloves, and a notebook. He told himself it was not an obsession, only caution, a desire to understand the land he had bought. But deep down he recognized the pull for what it was. He had opened a door, and now he could not close it. The forest seemed darker as he made his way toward the clearing. Branches wove tightly overhead, and the air felt damp and metallic, carrying a faint smell of stone. The circle of stones looked different, too, less like treasures and more like a broken seal. He widened the gap he had made before and lowered himself onto the stone steps. The cold air rushed up to meet him, and with every step downward, his unease grew sharper. The corridor welcomed him with the same silence, the same damp stone walls, the same echo of dripping water. But now he saw it all with new eyes. He crouched at the spot where he had found the corroded chain and the pieces of wood. Digging into the mud with his gloved hands, he dug up more remains. A rusted iron tool that might once have been a hammer, splinters of barrel pieces, and shards of glass dulled by time. Each piece spoke of lives that had once moved through this place. Men working in the glow of lanterns, leaving their marks behind. It was while turning over a rotted board that he made his most unsettling discovery. Pressed between layers of wood lay a scrap of paper, fragile but whole. Daniel lifted it carefully, half expecting it to fall apart in his hands. The ink was faded, but in one corner the numbers were clear, 1894. His breath caught. This was no ancient ruin. A little more than a century ago, people had been here, working, writing, leaving records. The thought filled him with both wonder and dread. He slipped the paper into his pocket, knowing it was proof that the villagers' warnings had roots in history. Still, he pressed on. At the edge of the chamber, he discovered another crate closer to the shore. With effort, he looped his rope around it and dragged it from the mud. The wood groaned, breaking apart beneath his grip. Inside lay a tangle of rusted tools, scraps of fabric, and beneath them, another page. This one was soaked, but still readable in places. His hands trembled as he brushed away slime. The words were faint, incomplete, but one phrase stood out. Leave before. The warning struck him like a blow. Leave before what? Before the water rose? Before the tunnels collapsed? Or before something far worse? He stared at the words, the paper limp in his hand, and felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Whoever had written it had meant to warn someone, perhaps themselves, perhaps others. But the message had come too late. The villager's silence took on new meaning as he stood in the chamber with the note in his hand. He remembered the old man's eyes, the heaviness in his voice when he had said, "People walked away and never returned." Perhaps they knew pieces of the story, passed down like an inheritance too heavy to bear. Perhaps that was why they never spoke of it openly. Daniel realized then that by digging into the earth, he had forced himself into their silence, whether he wanted it or not. And yet he could not stop. His flashlight beam swept across the far wall, and he noticed something unusual. The stone there looked less natural, as though bricks had been fitted together to hide another passage. His pulse quickened as he approached. The cement was crumbling, the bricks uneven. He pressed at them with his crowbar, and slowly they gave way, falling with dull thuds onto the damp floor. Behind them opened a narrow passage, partially collapsed, but still open. He ducked beneath a sagging beam and entered. The air here was thicker, almost suffocating, and the smell of rust and decay was stronger. Broken barrels lay scattered, their contents long since absorbed into the soil. But the faint smell of something chemical remained. He thought of powder, of explosives, of secret operations hidden away from the eyes of the law. The idea chilled him. This was no simple mine. This was something darker, a secret place abandoned in haste. He crouched to look at the walls and found more markings scratched into the stone. At first, they seemed random, but then their purpose became clear. Dozens of tally marks carved with desperate force, uneven lines counting something. Days perhaps, or failed attempts at escape. Daniel traced them with trembling fingers, the grooves biting cold into his skin. Beneath them, carved with greater force, were jagged words, "We cannot leave." His throat tightened. The weight of those words pressed against him like the air itself. This had been no work site, no place of business alone. It had been a prison. The tools, the crates, the broken beams, the scraps of fabric, everything came together into a truth he could not ignore. People had been trapped here, counting days in the dark, carving desperate words into the stone before vanishing into silence. Panic surged through him. The chamber seemed to close in, the air thick, the shadows too deep. He stumbled back toward the main hall, his flashlight beam jerking wildly over the walls. When he reached the chamber with the lake, he paused, gasping, his chest tight. The water lay still, unbroken, but he felt it watching him, waiting. His hand shook as he turned toward the corridor and began to climb back up the steps. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself resisted his escape. When at last he came out into daylight, he collapsed onto the grass, the forest around him silent and uncaring. The stones he had moved stared back at him like broken teeth, less a treasure now than a warning he had ignored. He pressed his face into his hands, the words from the wall echoing in his mind. "We cannot leave." The dripping never left him. Even after sealing the stones with his own hands, even after walking back across the meadow into the fragile comfort of his house, Daniel still heard it. At first, he thought it was memory sticking to him, but as the hours passed, he realized it was worse. The sound seemed to seep into the walls, faint but endless, as if the house itself had begun to echo the underground chamber. At night, he lay in bed, his eyes wide, his ears straining. Each drop marked time like the ticking of an ancient clock, patient and merciless. The scraps of paper he had found lay spread across his kitchen table. One carried the year 1894, another the incomplete warning, "Leave before," and the last the carved despair of people who had been trapped. "We cannot leave." He stared at them for hours, his vision blurring, the words twisting into accusations. He whispered them aloud, half hoping that speaking them might make their weight lighter. But the opposite happened. They seemed to grow heavier, sinking into him like stones. By morning, he knew he could not stay in the house. He walked from room to room, brushing his hands against the old wood, as though saying goodbye, though he had lived here only a short time. He thought of the villagers, of the silence in their eyes when he asked about the lake, and finally he understood. They had chosen not to speak of it because they knew silence was the only shield. He had shattered that shield, and now the weight of the secret pressed only on him. He packed a suitcase with little care, a few clothes, some books, his father's clock. The papers he debated over for a long while, staring at them as if deciding their fate. In the end, he slipped them into the suitcase as well. He could not abandon them, not after what he had seen. They belonged to him now, even if they were nothing but pieces of misery. As evening fell, he sat by the fire one last time, the warmth doing little to drive away the chill. The ticking of the clock filled the room, steady and merciless, like the dripping water he could not silence. Sleep did not come. Instead, he drifted in a fog of half-dreams. He saw the underground lake swelling, beams collapsing into black water, crates bursting apart to reveal twisted metal and rotted cloth. He heard voices he could not understand, whispering from the shadows, their words filled with dread. Each time he stirred awake, the sound of dripping remained, soft but insistent, as if the lake had followed him into his dreams and refused to let go. At dawn, he carried the suitcase to the car. The meadow was damp with dew, the air sharp with the cold bite of early morning. He paused at the clearing's edge and looked back at the house. For a brief moment, he considered staying, locking the door, pretending none of it had happened. But the thought dissolved almost immediately. The truth was there beneath the trees, beneath the stones, waiting. No door could keep it away. The car rumbled reluctantly to life, and he drove down the narrow road, his hands tight on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, he caught sight of the lake one last time. Mist drifted across its surface, softening its edges, making it appear almost beautiful. For an instant, he could almost believe it was peaceful. But he knew better. Its stillness was not peace. It was silence, the silence of secrets deliberately buried, of voices that had been smothered beneath stone and water, the silence of despair. The road carried him farther, the trees falling away, the mirror shrinking the lake until it vanished completely. Yet Daniel felt no relief. The weight remained in his chest, heavy and cold. He had told himself he would leave the secret behind, but he knew it would follow him wherever he went. The tally marks carved into stone, the desperate scratches of men who had counted days in the dark, the words, "We cannot leave," they belonged to the past, but now they belonged to him as well. He thought briefly of selling the property, of handing it to another person, but shame filled him at the thought. To lure someone else into that burden, to pass on the misery buried beneath the earth, would be betrayal. Yet he also knew he could not keep it. His mother would handle the sale, and he would distance himself, pretending the land was just land. But deep inside, he doubted the earth would keep its secrets for long. The lake had a way of calling, of whispering through silence until curiosity overcame fear. Someone else would come. Someone else would open the way. As the miles slipped by, Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel, his eyes burning, though no tears came. The The papers in his suitcase rustled faintly with each turn, like whispers reminding him of what he carried. He pressed harder on the accelerator, the empty road stretching endlessly before him. But no matter how far he drove, he felt the silence pressing close. The weight of the underground chamber wrapped around him like a second skin. He had left the city seeking freedom. He had left the house seeking peace. Instead, he had bound himself to a story older and darker than he could understand. The dripping of water, the tally marks carved into stone, the desperate words carved in jagged lines. They were carved into him now. He had become another name on the list, another mark on the wall, another soul claimed by the silence beneath the earth. And though he drove away, leaving the house and the meadow and the lake far behind, he knew with painful certainty that he would never truly leave. You've watched until the end, but this is only the beginning of more stories to come. What's next will surprise you even more. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which city or country you're watching from.